Hello, and welcome to the final class for Jesus as Political Radical. So I did not have a lot of luck recording this class when we did it in person again. And so I'd like to offer a recap of that lecture, a recap of what we discussed there. And I'm going to keep it relatively short, try to keep this to 30 or 40 minutes. But hopefully give you a sense, if you weren't able to attend that last session, about what we talked about. So we focused on the Richard Horsley book and brought our conversation about it to a conclusion. And the last chapter in that book, I guess it's the second to last chapter. The last chapter is sort of his summary, but this last sort of substantial section is about what he calls covenant renewal. And Horsley's thoughts on who Jesus was really revolve around two core missional aspects. I guess that's a good way to put it. One of them is the prophetic aspect. And this is really about producing a critique of the unjust power structures that were omnipresent in the Roman world and really calling those out and saying that, the people who are advancing these, political and economic programs that are very much at the expense of everyday Israelites, everyday peasants who are just trying to scrape by, that they stand in God's judgment. And, he was confrontational about that. He shows up at the temple and causes a scene. He's often depicted in conflict with the Pharisees. And it's often not about religious matters. I mean, I guess that's a problematic thing to say. What I should say is that, again, and this is going back to what we talked about in the first couple of classes, religion and politics were not separable in the ancient world. They were deeply entangled with each other. And so, when the Pharisees present him with something like, should we pay taxes to Caesar? He gives a response that's pretty antagonistic. We talked about that already. Basically, he says, "We'll render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." Being shown basically, a coin which would have had Caesar's head on it. The reason that was both politically and religiously antagonistic for Jesus to say that, often it's interpreted as it's okay for you to pay taxes as long as you sort of fulfill your religious obligations. Well, what Horsley points out, and again, we chatted about this already, but I'll just, recapitulate it. What Horsley points out is that the Hebrew scriptures are very clear. There's nothing that doesn't belong to God. Economics belongs to God. Society belongs to God. Political rulership belongs to God. And so Jesus, being deeply grounded in that tradition, when he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, what he's saying is, there's nothing that belongs to Caesar. All of it belongs to God. Caesar should get nothing. So that was a very, edgy thing to say. And that was the prophetic pronouncements that he was continually giving to both the Jewish community as well as to the Roman imperial forces in that area, and those two being the Jewish community that was in power very much being in collaboration with that Roman imperial power. He's producing a prophetic response to it. Okay, so that's one aspect of Jesus's missional work. The other aspect, according to Horsley, is that he was performing a renewal, that he was advocating for a renewal of the Mosaic covenant. He was lifting up the parts of the covenant of Moses, of the Hebrew scriptures, that would allow for a community to flourish. And there are a number of different points in this. So I'm going to talk about a couple of them. So let's see. Okay, so the first thing I'll talk about is if you grew up in a Protestant community or a Catholic community, and you read the scriptures or heard about them. I mean, one of the things that Jesus is known for is that he forgives people's sins. He's always forgiving people's sins. Like, you are forgiven, you are forgiven. So Horsley, if Horsley's going to produce an argument that Jesus's mission is not simply about the sort of privatized religious experience and the catharsis that can happen around a personal religious experience where you sort of feel like, oh, my conscience is cleared or something along those lines. Horsley has to show that Jesus, in continuing to advocate that and continuing to tell people that their sins are forgiven, he has to show that that has a social component to it. So how does he do that? What argument does he make? Well, part of what he says is that you have to understand the theology in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Jewish tradition as it was, formed at that point. And one of the things that Horsley points out is that a big part of Jewish theology is that you have a covenant with God. Israel has a covenant with God. And if you are honoring that covenant with God, God is going to favor you. And if you're not honoring that covenant with God, God will turn God's back on you. And there are a lot of passages about that. And there are prophets who come out and say that. Jeremiah is like a really great example of a prophet who comes out and says, you have, betrayed the central covenant in Judaism. You've turned away from the laws that God has given, and therefore that you will be punished. And that's why we are being punished by for Jeremiah, it was outside foreign forces that were coming in to colonize Israel, and in fact take people into captivity and take them elsewhere. And so there was this notion that we did something wrong, which is why God is punishing us. Not so different from the kinds of theologies that we hear today. There's very much a sense of theology today that you can hear it in very different religious traditions. That's the sort of notion of if we're pleasing God, God's going to give us good things, and if we're not pleasing God, God is going to punish us. Okay, so what's going on for these peasants, these peasants in Israel, these people who are sort of economically marginalized? Horsley points out their land is being taken away. The taxes have increased to a substantial portion. Why did they increase? Well, you're not only paying taxes to the temple system in Israel, but you're also paying taxes to the temple, to Israel's the client king in Israel that Rome had appointed, and then you're paying taxes to Rome as well. So we have a tax structure that is basically tripled. And I don't know exactly what the amount was and how much it increased, but you're paying taxes to three bodies rather than one. And what is this What's happening here is that if peasants owned their land, they would, maybe be able to produce enough harvests that they could give some off the top, to these rulers. But when you increase the weight of that so much, then they're not going to be able to make it through the year without starving and without needing to borrow money. And so debting became this really huge issue in Jesus's time. And what happens, like when you make debts, that you take on debts that you can't pay, well, your property, whatever you have, gets foreclosed on. And so that was happening. That was happening as well. So anyway, Jesus is he's working in that context. I'm going to talk a lot more about how he's intervening in those particular issues. But just going back to this sort of theological, psychological mechanism here. The reason, you can very well imagine, a peasant person in the first century in Israel, the reason I'm in debt up to my neck and I have to give up my property is because I've been a bad person. God is judging me. God did this to me. I deserve it. So Jesus is going around in these communities. He's probably hearing from folks this sort of basic covenantal theology. We've broken the covenant. This is why the Romans are here. This is why we're being oppressed. What does Jesus tell them? Does he tell them, yeah, like you're bad, you should be better? No, he actually does something really amazingly freeing. Your sins are forgiven. You don't need to worry about that. Let it go. Let it go, and then try to build a more hopeful community with each other, which is the next part. I'm going to get to that. But I'm going to give you he says, I'm going to give you the tools to build a community in the midst of all of this domination that can respond to the disintegration that's happening, the social disintegration that's happening. One of the things we talked about was, is there a contemporary, corollary for that? And I think you can obviously see that theologically, as I mentioned. There's a way in which there's a very secular version of this, though. And maybe this will be a sermon one of these days. Stay tuned. The secular version, I think, would be white guilt. I think the secular version would be economic devastation. I'm sorry, ecological devastation. It's the sense of myself being a part of this group, whether that's relatively affluent Westerners or whether that is, the racially dominant group, white Americans. I'm a part of this group that has done a lot of harm, and I feel a lot of guilt around that. In fact, I feel so much guilt around it that I feel paralyzed to do anything. The harm has been so severe. It seems like there's nothing I can do. I'm just utterly caught up in this horrible structure, and I feel horrible about it, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. What do we take from, thinking about the message of what Jesus said in the first century? Your sins are forgiven. Let it go. Don't worry about the guilt. Instead, worry about what it is that you can do right here, right now, with a particular group of people who want to make a difference around this. That'll be much more productive than holding on to this guilt. Okay, so I actually think that's a very relevant message that he was giving. So, and when Jesus says, like, your sins are forgiven, I think it's really important that we notice this is not about him doing some very individualized, deal of, like, I don't know, a sort of, a confessional thing, and everybody has original sin, and I'm sort of like doing this like very individualized spiritual work. He's fundamentally addressing something that's blocking the capacity to create social change, which is this sense of guilt, like I did something wrong, which is why I'm inside this awful situation. He's like, no, let that go. And by letting that go, we're going to be able to create something different here now. Okay, so that's a piece of what he's doing. A couple of other things. One is that so Horsley talks about Jesus focusing on expelling occupying alien forces. So what does he mean by that? Occupying alien forces. Well, I brought that up in the group and people said the Romans, right? And it's like, yes, it is the Romans. It is the Romans. That's right. But again, going to this first century mindset where there is no differentiation between religion and politics. And every political force, including the Romans, to a first century peasant has a spiritual corollary to it. What are we looking at? Well, the spiritual corollary to the Romans in Jesus's time are this sort of demonic force. It's Satan, it's Beelzebub. It's they have lots of different names for these forces. You might remember I talked a couple of sessions back about Jesus's exorcism of the demon that identified itself as Legion. Again, what is a legion? A legion was a name for the Roman army. The people who would have heard this demon speak out of this man's mouth and identifying itself as legion would have known very intimately what a Roman army was. Roman armies would march through the countryside. They would take what they want. They would often be very brutal to local populations. Fear of violence, retaliation, just, really very little protection against that particular group. And so when the demon identifies itself as I am Legion, it's very clear that it is a spiritual force and it is a political force at the same time. And that's because in the ancient world, we didn't have that neat separation between religion and politics, right? So what is Jesus doing? What's Jesus's role with that? Well, liberal churches tend to think about Jesus as this moral teacher. Jesus, Jesus says, doing the Sermon on the Mount and, telling us nice things about like turning the other cheek in that, though, of course, I've already talked about how that's probably a bit more complex than we might necessarily think. We think of that as like sort of Jesus is advocating utter passivity. Walter Wink, who is a fabulous biblical scholar, I have his book around here somewhere, Engaging the Powers, talks about how turning the other cheek was an act of resistance. Is it basically was an insistence that you were not going to be struck as a subordinate, you are going to be struck as an equal. So it was another way of kind of turning the tables on the powerful. But I lost my train of thought here. So where were we? Expelling occupying forces. Okay. So yes, Jesus, liberal churches talk about Jesus as being this like we'll emphasize sort of the very humanistic aspects of what Jesus does. And he's like an instructor, he's an educator, and he's teaching us these like nice things about how to live in society. Well, what Horsley points out is that that's all fine and good, but the oldest sources, especially the Gospel of Mark, that and the Q source are the oldest sources that we have about the gospel tradition, the tradition about Jesus. Paul's letters are earlier, but Paul did not know Jesus personally. Rather, these are accounts of Jesus's life, and these are the earliest accounts that we have, Mark and Q. So Mark really doesn't have a lot of those like teachings in it. The Gospel of Mark doesn't. Instead, that's stuff that's coming from Matthew and Luke. What does Mark have? Mark really emphasizes Jesus as healer and exorcist. Exorcist. So what do we do with that? Like, what do we do with like Jesus as exorcist? Like, it sounds so, quixotic and exotic and strange. And what could that possibly have to do about, if we're not sort of like hearing these nice spiritual lessons about, how to change our lives, or even lessons about how to change power relations or something along those lines. How could Jesus be sort of teaching and interfering with Roman dominance? Well, if we look at exorcism not simply as this super bizarre, quixotic, almost horror movie-esque type situation that Jesus is doing with individuals, but instead look at it as there are occupying forces from this outside culture that has entered into Israelite culture, is exploiting and dominating it in multiple ways, and it's causing a spiritual crisis among people. Jesus's exorcism of that force is a way of ejecting it and bringing up to consciousness that people are under this spiritual duress, and really purging it and expelling it from there. Just the last thing on that, which is that there are studies that have been done of colonized people that say that when a community is newly colonized, and this is a community of people who are sort of in this more pre-modern mindset, they end up sometimes representing what's happening to them as a spiritual problem. They will say things like, there's suddenly this new spirit that has arrived and is terrorizing us, and it just happens to coincide with the arrival of colonizers. Richard Horsley very much thinks that what is happening for Jesus is that as the Romans arrived and started terrorizing, exploiting, dominating the Israelites, it was producing that same spiritual crisis. And Jesus's intervention as an exorcist was to purge, was to work on purging that. Okay. Sins are forgiven. I'm exorcising these alien forces. And then what's next? Horsley talks a little bit about healing the social body. So as I mentioned, Jesus is an exorcist. But the other side of that coin is that Jesus is also a healer, and lots of people come to Jesus for healing, especially in the Gospel of Mark. This is really, highly emphasized. So I think a couple of things are going on in this, in the healings with Jesus. One is that you can have a similar reading that I just mentioned with the exorcists with illness. There is a social component to illness. One of the things that Horsley talks about in another book is that illness is, it's not simply disease. Illness is something that arises with sort of the confluence of social forces, interpretive forces that are seeing what's happening within a body. We might think today of, I could think of a couple of things, but I'm just going to mention one. One that we would not have found in Jesus's time: anorexia. Anorexia is a pretty unique modern illness, which is not for a moment to say it's not real. It's very real. People die from it. That's how real it is. People get very, very sick from it. But it is a modern illness. It's one that is unique to Western cultures. And as Western culture has diffused to the rest of the world, other cultures have begun to exhibit it as well. There are particular things that constellate around this, along with, you know, the construction of femininity and what women are supposed to look like, and representation in terms of images, stuff we see on television and commercials. There's lots of things that come together to create that as a particular illness that is emerging in actual people. It's not just, you know, a concept. It's like really emerging in particular people, in particular bodies. And it's really that constellation of social forces that are coming together. Okay, so what does this have to do with what Jesus is doing? Well, Jesus is going around as a healer and healing people who are economically disadvantaged, like they cannot afford to go see whatever, you know, the medical community would have looked very different back then, but they could not afford to go do that. And Jesus is very much addressing illnesses that are emerging in that community that may very well be anchored in the social circumstances that were unique to that time period. So that's one aspect of how we can think about that. The other aspect of how we can think about it is that there's a way in which the illnesses that Mark talks about are a sort of metaphorized way of exploring what's wrong with Israel at that particular moment. So Jesus heals a 12-year-old girl, brings her back to life. And Jesus also heals a woman who has been hemorrhaging blood for 12 years. 12. Why is 12 significant? 12 tribes of Israel, right? It's a very significant number in Jewish tradition. And so what Jesus, let's just take the issue of the woman who's hemorrhaging. Jesus heals this woman who has been hemorrhaging blood for 12 years. 12 tribes of Israel hemorrhaging blood, hemorrhaging the life force. It is being bled dry by these foreign invading forces. Rome is bleeding Israel dry. Like there's, you know, it's almost like the metaphor is too obvious to miss. Or Jesus is coming, now moving on to the other one, to the young girl, to bring the 12-year-old girl, 12 tribes of Israel, back to life. So we have the deeply metaphorized like sense of what's happening in terms of illness. here. All right, great. So forgiving sins, relieving guilt, expelling alien occupying forces, and healing the social body. So those are three of the things that Jesus is doing here. So, all right, the next part that is important to think about are the ways that Jesus is lifting up parts of the Mosaic covenant and really using that as a template to think about how communities should organize today. So what he talks about, what Horsley talks about is that Jesus would one of the things that Jesus was really advocating for was cancellation of debt. At the beginning of the class that I taught this week that wasn't recorded, we talked about the Lord's Prayer. And a part of the Lord's Prayer is forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Some scholars suggest that a better translation of that is actually forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. This is a theme in Jesus's sayings, which is that debts should be canceled. We should cancel each other's debts. So why would he be saying that? Well, let's again go into the mindset of these first century peasant communities. What's happening there? Well, they're being bled dry, from taxation. People are being pushed to the edge of destitution. They're probably getting very, very desperate. They are asking each other for money and asking each other for probably food, more so than money, and then probably not able to really pay it back, right? I mean, if you're living on the edge of subsistence, you never really get that advantage of being able to say, okay, now I have enough that I can pay it back. What Horsley speculates on is that, well, he doesn't even speculate. He shows some sociological evidence that when this does happen to subsistence farming, communities that are kind of living hand to mouth with their crops, it produces a tremendous social strain. People begin really hating each other, despising each other. All kinds of conflicts break out in communities where that's happening. So we go back to, what is Jesus doing? He's going in and he's saying, forgive each other's debts. Forgive each other's debts. Where's that coming from? Well, that's coming from the Jewish tradition, right? Like, that is not something he's inventing. There are deep resources within Judaism for thinking about forgiveness of debts. One of the things that the Mosaic covenant did is it tried to set up a structure in which no person would hoard too much wealth, and the communities would then not be forced to bear that kind of strain. So parts of the Hebrew scriptures forbid taking interest on loans. There are Jubilee years, which are years in which, if somebody has a debt, you need to forgive it. And then I think it's really significant that, Jesus's prayer is, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So basically, whether someone is in debt, owes us money, or whether we owe them money, let's forgive that so that we can start anew with a social template that's not contaminated with resentment and with hatred and with division. So that is a really important piece of this communal renewal that Jesus is talking about here. So let's see, what else do I want to share? Okay, so marriage and children. Jesus is kind of an interesting figure when it comes to marriage, because I talked about Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and her concept of Jesus is actually falling pretty far outside the social role of masculinity. And the reason for that is that masculinity in the ancient Roman world was not constructed in the way that we construct male and female, masculine and feminine today. You know, today it's really about what kind of genitalia you have, right? That's what defines you as a man or a woman. In Jesus's time, not so much. It was you basically had the construct of a man or of masculinity, and that did not necessarily have to do with whether you simply had the right genitalia, and instead it was really a confluence of things. To be a man in ancient Roman culture was to be married. It was to be the lord over a house. It was to be able to, you know, so you were the lord over a wife, over children, over slaves. And if you were a man, if you were male, and you did not occupy that role, let's say that you were a male slave and you were not able to marry, and you were forced to submit to the head of a household, you were not considered to be a man. You were not considered to occupy that space of masculinity, right? So basically, you pretty much had this maybe a spectrum where you have on the one side someone who is male, who heads a household, who occupies that role. And then to varying degrees, you have people who fall outside of that role. The really important thing here is that, you know, masculinity or maleness or manhood or whatever, it was really a confluence of sociological factors. It was not about biology. Okay, what does that do to Jesus, to our understanding of Jesus? Well, Jesus falls pretty far outside that ideal. He was not married. He did not have children, at least not as far as we know. I even mentioned, you know, there was some, you know, sort of whimsical speculation. I would say back when the Da Vinci Code, very like fantasy, when the Da Vinci Code came out about Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene and maybe having this bloodline and this lineage and yada yada. I kind of hope he didn't. And the reason is because I actually think that that's more radical, that he sort of, you know, eschewed the trappings of marriage and fell, you know, in a very different social location than, you know, being a male householder. Okay, so anyway, that's one important part of thinking about Jesus. That's again like coming from the work of Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, this really influential feminist theologian and historian. But one of the things Horsley points out is that Jesus's teachings about marriage were maybe somewhat in tension with that. He doesn't really talk about what I just talked about there, but what Horsley does talk about is that Jesus actually emphasized staying in marriage, and he did not advocate for sort of uprooting yourself socially. He talked about forbidding divorce. It's an interesting question about why that might be, and I think again we need to try to go back and mentally occupy that early early first century, community mindset. So what's happening to someone who is who gets a divorce? What happens to that social unit? Well, Horsley talks about how it was possible that what was happening at the time and what Jesus was addressing was this idea that sometimes the wealthy would get divorced and remarry, and it was in order to solidify economic position. Almost like, look, somebody better with more money just came along, and they're interested in me, so I'm gonna go in that direction and get rid of that. So and at the time there were more liberal divorce laws that were available to people. So people were getting divorced more regularly. Okay, so so that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that we might think about, currently, who's sort of arguing in our society about whether we should have more complicated and difficult divorce laws. That tends to be more social conservatives, right? They're not in favor of sort of easy divorce, whereas people who are more liberal are, and oftentimes they are because of a feminist conviction, which is that a lot of times marriages aren't great, and they're particularly not great for the person who is economically subordinate, and so they're particularly not great for women. So allowing somebody to leave a household to who might be, say, being abused by a partner or something like that, that's a more, tends to be a more liberal position. Well, anyway, in the ancient world, it actually might have benefited women more. It's possible that it could have benefited women more not to have such easy divorce laws. Why would that be? Well, when women really could not work outside the home, when that was really not a sort of a woman who's unattached was really not sort of a thinkable social position. If a man simply divorces his wife and goes and marries someone else, that could leave that woman with her children in a very destitute position. So those are two potential reasons why Jesus advocates against divorce, because he sees like how dangerous it is for people who are in the more marginalized position to be kind of cast out and let go of, and then they have to fend for themselves. Okay, so all of that. The other thing that Jesus says, and that Horsley points out, is that children were, it was sort of interesting what was happening with children at that point. So we tend to think about Jesus's language around children, blessed are the children, the kingdom of God belongs to the children, as being somewhat sentimental. But one of the things Horsley points out is that our concept of childhood, with all of the cushioning around it and all of the developmental perspective and psychology around it, is very, very new. And in fact, it was often much more challenging and difficult to be a child in other societies that didn't have that same degree of cushioning. Specifically, just making it to like age 12 was a feat. A lot of children died. So what Horsley says here is that this is actually another way in which Jesus is really looking at the people who are sort of the physically most vulnerable, in the most precarious position, and saying, we need to look to them because that's who the kingdom of God belongs to. Like, they're the ones who are favored, the people who are the most precarious and the most vulnerable. And I think also a sort of corollary ethical obligation there. We need to care for these people who are in this vulnerable space. This is really a piece of Jesus's concept of what a covenantal community is doing. We look at the people who are in the most precarious and vulnerable places as we're thinking about how to knit together our community. So we're going to forgive each other's debts, and we're going to let go of our resentments. We're going to honor our marriage commitments so that, we're not leaving people in places of destitution. And we're going to look towards the people who are the most vulnerable and really take care of them. Okay, so that concludes the piece about Horsley. The last thing I want to just talk a little bit about, I gave people a homework assignment. So if you weren't there for the final class, like, you missed the final exam. So, and I know I think I said I was going to do a half an hour video here, and I'm pretty sure I'm like way beyond a half an hour. So I hope you're sticking with me through this. I'm gonna finish this up by talking about the parable of the talents. Parable of the talents is it's a parable from Jesus that has really perplexed me for years, because I remember hearing it in grade school. I went to a Lutheran grade school, and the explanation that was given for it was just so bizarre to me, and I just was like, it just doesn't sound right. It sounds like there's something wrong with it. So I won't read the whole thing here, but I'll just kind of summarize it, which is that basically there's this wealthy householder, this landholder, this aristocrat, who decides to leave and go on a trip, and he calls 3 servants to him, and he says to them, they've each done well for him in the past, and so he says to them, I'm going to give one of you 5 talents, one of you 2 talents, and I'm going to give 1 talent to someone else. And he says, I want you to care for this while I'm away. So the person who's given the 5 talents invests his money, and when the master comes back, he says, where's my money? And the guy says, I brought you. I haven't only brought you 5 talents. I brought you 10 talents, 10, and it's because I invested it wisely. And the master's like, oh yeah, that's perfect. And the master ends up saying to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. The guy who was given 2 talents comes back with 4 talents, and the master's like, I've given you little, but this is you've done good. Like, you've been a good and faithful servant. I'm going to set you over much. So then the last person shows up, and he was given 1 talent. And this is what he says to the master. I'm going to read this part. He says, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. So basically just buried it and then just brought it back. No interest on it. Okay. So this is what the master says. You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have scattered no seed, then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers. And at my coming, I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Cast the worthless servant out into the outer darkness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So traditional Christian theology has interpreted the master as being God and said it's God. And I remember learning in my Lutheran grade school, there was a participant in the class this week who remembered the same teaching, that this was really a teaching about, God has given you certain like talents. Talent is not, so anyway, God has given you certain talents and you're expected to use those talents. And if you don't capitalize on those talents for God, that's a waste. You're wasting what God has given you, and that's bad. Of course, that relies on reinterpreting the meaning of talent, because talent in this means money. It doesn't mean, abilities like athletic abilities or artistic abilities. But the bigger question for me, the part that for me really just bothered me, and that I was never able to kind of let go of and think different and, feel okay with, is that God sounds horrible in this. God sounds like really nasty. He, basically, he's throwing this person out, into, weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it doesn't even seem like he did anything wrong. He just protected the money that the master had, entrusted to him. So what are we to make of this? Is this actually God? Is the master actually supposed to be God? Well, we have some clues, I think, based on what we've been reading in Horsley, based on this notion of Jesus as political radical, based on this notion of Jesus as being someone who was, opposing empire and really trying to come up with a response against the economic domination that was happening. I don't think that this is God in this parable. I think that this is a parable about Rome and about its economic domination. And I'm not the only one. William Herzog is someone who wrote a book, I think it's called Jesus as Pedagogue of the Oppressed, the Parables as Subversive Speech. And he does this sort of, he's a historian, he's a New Testament scholar, and he digs into the same kind of economic political reading and comes up with this interpretation of this parable. But basically, the argument that he's making is that Jesus is stating this parable to talk about how corrupt and evil the social situation in Roman occupied Palestine is. Essentially, what you have to understand is that the people who were given the talents and then went out and invested them and got money back, well, who were they lending that money to? They were lending it to the people who in Israel would have been pretty destitute and pretty desperate. How would they have gotten the payment back? It's probably unlikely that they got 100% interest on that loan without, say, foreclosing on someone's property. It's highly unlikely that somebody was able to, turn that around in such a relatively short period of time. Probably some sort of economic domination was occurring in that instance. And so they went and participated in that. The master's thrilled, he gets more. And then it's so interesting to me that he says, you have done well, my good and faithful servant. I appointed you over little, now I will appoint you over much, which is basically like, I'm going now, now that you've proven yourself, I'm going to really deeply entangle you in this problematic, horrible system. So what do we make of the last person? Well, the last person says, I knew you reap where you do not sow. I knew you to be a hard person, a hard man. Essentially, he's playing the role of like whistleblower. He's saying what you're doing is wrong. You are, you're taking money that should not be yours. You're collecting interest. Collecting interest is, as I mentioned already, explicitly against a couple of different passages in the Hebrew scriptures. So you are taking what is not yours. And so this servant is really standing up and saying, I don't think this is right. Another passage in the scriptures, interestingly, says that if you want to protect someone's belongings or protect their money, what you should do is bury it. It doesn't say invest it, it says bury it. He buries it. He does the faithful thing. And because of that, he is cast out into the darkness. Really interesting piece here is that the notion of gnashing of teeth, one translation for that might be a bit more accurate is that it meant that the person was cold. So basically, like it means the master has stripped them of everything and then cast them out into the cold. So made them economically destitute. And that is the cost of speaking up against this system. So Jesus is basically saying this system is horrible, it's corrupt, and when you try to speak up against it, you are punished. And that is what we are up against. It is a really cutting social critique. The one last thing that we would need to be able to do in order to make this work is address this one particular line, and I'll read it and then I'm going to wrap up. This line that's part of, let's see, so verse 29. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But for the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. So if that's in there, then that doesn't really work with the interpretation that I've just been spelling out. So is that, what do we make of that? Well, I mean, one of the things we know about the gospel according to Matthew is that he often, at the end of Jesus's parables, tacks on his own interpretation. You might check out the parable of the unjust judge or the persistent widower. Similar thing happening there. He sort of gives this like neat little, tacks this neat little meaning on to the end of it. Well, scholars think that line is not authentic to the parable as it was originally told. And when you take that away, it seems very difficult for me to read that passage and think, oh, this is Jesus talking about God. Where, in so many other passages, Jesus is talking about, God as being this loving force who's going to give you, your daily bread and et cetera, et cetera. This loving parent who's going to, give you what you need. This just seems so antithetical to that. And I think that it might be good that it's antithetical to that, because I think that this is one of the more radical parables in there. It is a really scathing critique of the economic domination that was happening in Jesus's time. So, Jesus and empire. That's pretty much where I want to end. I hope that this class was interesting to you and that you learned something new. For me, going into this material, I would say, as someone who, I grew up Unitarian Universalist. I did go to, for a few years to, a Lutheran grade school, but I haven't necessarily resonated with, some of the more spiritual and theological, teachings in Christianity. But when I'm able to enter the topic of Jesus's teachings, his life, his actions, his exorcisms, his healings, from this perspective, and really thinking that he had this mission of, offering prophetic critique, and at the same time trying to, restore communities to sustainability, to healing, and to justice, I feel like I have a way in to Jesus's teachings and to his life, and there's something for me that just really resonates, and that really resonates with our contemporary political moment. I think this is very, very relevant. So I hope that there's something in here that has been relevant to you. I look forward to our next class. I'm not exactly sure what that would be. I welcome suggestions. I'm thinking that through right now. And my spiritual companions, thank you so much for participating in this 4-week exploration with me. It's been a wonderful time. All right, take good care.